This isn't just a story. I don't care if you believe me or not. But I need to get this off my chest, because what happened that night, well, let's just say I haven't had a good night's sleep since. You grow up hearing all kinds of scary stories. Silly campfire tales, urban legends whispered to give you a thrill. But by morning, they fade into nothing. You laugh them off, thinking they're just stories, harmless shadows in the dark. But I'm telling you, the collector is real. I know because I saw him, and trust me, I wish I hadn't. It was Halloween night. The kind of cold, crisp autumn night that seems perfect for the holiday. The air had that familiar sharpness, the kind that makes you shiver just a little. Our small suburb looked picture perfect, with kids in costumes running from house to house, their parents following close behind. The houses were decked out in Halloween decorations, fake cobwebs, plastic skeletons hanging from doorways, and jack-o'-lanterns glowing on porches like tiny guardians watching over the night. It felt like every other Halloween. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first, but that's what makes it worse. It wasn't a night that screamed danger, no sign that anything unusual was about to happen. But looking back, there were signs, small ones, that we missed. As the night dragged on, something in the air shifted. The usual sounds of kids laughing, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the murmur of parents chatting, all of it started to fade until it was just quiet. Too quiet. A kind of silence that creeps into your bones. That was the first sign. But at the time, I shrugged it off. By 10 p.m., the streets were empty. That wasn't unusual, a Halloween always wrapped up early around here. But this time, it wasn't just the emptiness that got to me. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like something is watching you even when there's no one around. The streetlights seemed dimmer, casting long shadows that felt a little too dark, a little too thick. Something wasn't right, but none of us realized it yet. That night, like every Halloween, I was hanging out with my friends Jake, Sam, and Ellie. We were in that weird stage of life where we were too old to trick or treat, but too young to be invited to any serious Halloween parties. So we did what we always did, gathered around the fire pit in my backyard, carving pumpkins, telling dumb stories, and making fun of each other. It was our tradition. We'd all grown up together in the same small town where nothing exciting ever happened. It was always the same thing year after year. That night was supposed to be no different. We were laughing, goofing around, throwing pumpkin guts at each other when Jake brought up the story. You know the type, the kind of local legend that gets passed down from kid to kid, growing weirder with each retelling. Every small town has one, and ours was the collector. Jake didn't mean to scare us when he mentioned it, at least. I don't think he did. He was just talking, like it was nothing. You guys know about the collector, right? He said, casually tossing a chunk of pumpkin guts into the fire. He's supposed to come for you if you leave your jack-o'-lantern lit past midnight. We all rolled our eyes. We'd heard the story before. It's the kind of legend that's more annoying than scary. According to the tale, every few years, someone would go missing on Halloween night. It was always different people, but the story said they vanished in the same way, no struggle, no sign of a break-in, just gone. The only thing left behind was an empty house and a jack-o'-lantern still burning on their porch. The warning was simple. If you leave your pumpkin lit past midnight, the collector will come for you. Jake loved that kind of stuff. He was always the one pushing us to do things we didn't want to do, daring us to break the rules just for fun. We should leave our pumpkins out tonight, he said, grinning like he'd just come up with the best idea ever. You know, see if the collector shows up. I laughed it off at first, thinking he was just messing around. But something about the way he said it stuck with me. Maybe it was the quiet that had settled over the neighborhood, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to grow darker around us. But suddenly, the idea didn't seem so funny anymore. Sam was the first to say something. "Dude, that's just a stupid story. We're not gonna waste time waiting for some made-up guy to show up." Ellie, always the most cautious of the group, shook her head. "I don't know. Something feels weird tonight. Maybe we shouldn't mess with it." But Jake, being Jake, wouldn't let it go. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? It's just a dumb legend. What's the worst that could happen?" Looking back, I wish we had listened to Ellie, but we were bored, and the idea of doing anything seemed better than just sitting around. So we agreed. We'd leave our pumpkins lit until after midnight, just to see what happened. We finished carving our pumpkins around 11:30 p.m. There were 4 of them, glowing on my front porch, their flickering light casting long, eerie shadows on the walls of my house. We were still laughing, cracking jokes about the collector and how dumb the whole thing was. But as the minutes ticked closer to midnight, the mood started to change. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling like the air around us had gotten heavier. The sky was clear, no clouds, no wind, but it felt like the darkness itself was pressing down on us. The shadows from our pumpkins seemed to stretch out, growing larger, swallowing up the light around them. The street, already empty, now looked even darker, like something was hiding just out of sight. Jake was still trying to keep the mood light, making jokes about how we should take pictures of our pumpkins to prove the collector didn't exist. But none of us were laughing anymore. Sam kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was expecting something or someone to jump out at him. Ellie's face had gone pale, and she was muttering something about it being late, saying she wanted to go home. I didn't blame her. I was starting to feel uneasy too. Then midnight came. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It hit me all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door and let the icy air spill out. I could see my breath, even though it hadn't been that cold a moment ago. The second thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, like the world had just stopped. And then, the lights went out. It wasn't just the porch lights, it was everything. The street lights, the houses, even the flickering light from our pumpkins vanished, plunging us into complete darkness. For a moment, none of us moved. I couldn't even hear anyone breathing. It was like we were frozen, waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound, like metal dragging against the pavement. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. "Do you guys hear that?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. We all did. The sound was faint at first, but it was getting louder, closer. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. The darkness felt alive, like it was closing in on us, suffocating. And then I saw him. A figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible in the darkness. He was dragging something behind him, a sack, heavy and lumpy, scraping along the ground. His face, I can't describe it. It was like looking at a shadow, a blur where his features should have been. But I knew, deep down, that this was the collector. None of us said a word. We just stood there, frozen in terror, as he walked past us, his eyes, if he had any, locked on the glowing pumpkins still sitting on my porch. He didn't look at us. He didn't have to. We weren't his target. Not yet. The scraping sound faded as he disappeared into the shadows. And just like that, the lights flickered back on. The pumpkins were still there, their flames burning brightly, as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. We didn't talk about it after that night. We never left our pumpkins lit past midnight again. And every year, when Halloween rolls around, I can still hear that scraping sound in the back of my mind. The collector is real. And if you're smart, you'll make sure your pumpkin goes out before midnight. Then midnight struck. The clock chimed softly, and for a moment, everything felt still. We stood on the porch, glancing at each other, waiting for something to happen. I checked my watch, 12:01. The minutes crawled by. I looked again, 12:05. Still, nothing. We laughed nervously, thinking it was just a silly story we'd heard about Halloween. But then, out of nowhere, a cold breeze swept through the street, sharp and biting. It felt like an icy hand brushing against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. "Did you feel that?" Ellie asked, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Yeah, it's freezing," Sam said, his breath visible in the air. The temperature had dropped so fast that it caught us off guard, and a wave of unease washed over us. I glanced at the others, and their expressions mirrored my own confusion and fear. The wind wasn't the only thing that changed. Suddenly, the streetlights flickered overhead. At first, it was just a flicker here and there, but then they went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from our jack-o'-lanterns, glowing dimly on the porch. Their flickering flames danced wildly, casting eerie shadows across our faces. That's when I saw it. At the end of the street stood a figure. It was tall, way too tall, cloaked in shadows. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us. I squinted, trying to make out its features, but it was too dark. I couldn't see a face, couldn't even tell if it had one at all. But I could feel its eyes boring into me, penetrating my very soul. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and I instinctively took a step back. "Is anyone else seeing this?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. We all nodded, frozen in place. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drum echoing in the silence. Yet my legs felt heavy, as if glued to the spot. Then, the figure began to walk. Its movements were slow and deliberate, each step heavy and purposeful. I could hear the scraping sound of something dragging along the pavement. It sent chills down my spine. That's when I noticed what it was carrying: a lantern. But not just any lantern. This one was different. The flame inside flickered a sickly, ghostly blue, casting twisted shadows that danced ominously around us. The whispers started next. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But then I heard my name soft and distant, like someone was standing just behind me, whispering it over and over. "Emily." It sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there, just darkness, thick and suffocating. Ellie was the first to break. "We have to blow out the candles," she screamed, backing away from the porch in sheer panic. "It's not safe." She sprinted toward the pumpkins, Sam right behind her, trying to blow out the flames. But no matter how hard we tried, the candles wouldn't go out. They flickered stubbornly, like they had a will of their own, refusing to die. And the collector kept coming. I could see the outline of something twisted beneath the cloak, something that looked wrong, something that wasn't human. Jake, who had always been fearless, stood silent now. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He tried to laugh it off, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Guys, we should really get inside," he said, his voice shaky. I wanted to agree, but every part of me felt paralyzed. I was rooted to the spot, watching as the figure moved closer and closer. Then, it stopped, right in front of us. The lantern swung back and forth, casting its eerie glow over me. illuminating the fear etched on my friends' faces. I felt something cold seep into my bones, a chill that was deeper than the autumn air. The flame inside the lantern flared brighter, and shadows danced around us, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. The smell of burnt leaves filled the air, mixed with something metallic like blood. My stomach churned at the thought. The whispers grew louder, no longer soft and distant. They were all around us now, deafening, calling our names over and over. Emily. Sam. It felt like a cacophony, pulling me deeper into the darkness, drowning out everything else. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could hear were those voices, spiraling me down into panic. Just then, a sudden rush of courage surged through me. "We need to go," I shouted, breaking the spell that held us. I turned to grab Ellie's hand, ready to bolt inside. But before we could move, the figure lifted the lantern, and the flame burst into a blinding light. For a moment, everything was illuminated, and I saw the collector in full view. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out sharp features and empty eye sockets that seemed to suck in the light. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, captivated by the horror before me. Then the lantern swung lower, and the light dimmed, plunging us back into darkness. The whispers came again, clearer this time, swirling around us like a storm. I felt the cold seep deeper, touching my very core. Suddenly, I felt a tug at my arm. It was Jake. "Come on," he yelled, pulling me toward the door. But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, blocking our way. Its presence was suffocating, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. My heart raced as I stumbled backward. I felt Ellie's grip tighten on my hand as we turned to run, the fear propelling us forward. We dashed toward the house, breathless and terrified. But as we reached the door, we found it was locked. I fumbled with the handle, my hands shaking. "Open! Open!" I cried, panic rising. Behind us, I could hear the figure moving closer, the scraping sound echoing in my ears. Finally, the door swung open, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. We quickly bolted the door and huddled together in the dim light of the living room. "What was that thing?" Sam panted, his face pale. "What do we do now?" "We stay quiet," I whispered. "Maybe it won't find us." But as I said that, we heard it outside. The whispers were louder now, filling the air like a thick fog. It felt like the darkness was alive, wrapping around our house. I glanced out the window, heart racing, and saw the figure standing on the porch, the blue lantern glowing brightly. Time seemed to stretch, and I felt like we were trapped in some nightmare. We could only wait and hope it would leave us alone. But deep down, I knew we weren't safe. Hours later, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced, my body heavy with exhaustion. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I looked out the window, my stomach dropped. The jack-o'-lantern was still there on the porch, its candle flickering faintly in the early morning light. But that wasn't all. Jake was gone. I rushed to his house, my heart pounding. But when I knocked on the door, his parents looked at me with worried eyes. They didn't know where he was. No one had seen him since that night. It felt like he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the pumpkin on his porch, its candles still burning. The collector took him. I don't know where Jake is now, or if he's even still alive. But I know one thing. The legend is real. The collector is real. Every Halloween, When the air turns cold and the shadows grow longer, I see that lantern in my dreams. The twisted flame, the figure watching from a distance, waiting. I moved out of that neighborhood years ago, hoping to escape the memories. But you can't outrun the collector. He'll come back. Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but he'll come. So, if you ever find yourself outside on Halloween night, and you see a jack-o'-lantern still burning long after the streets are empty, blow it out. Don't take chances. Don't test the legend, because the collector is always watching.